So now I want to talk a little bit about sort of what happens before a conference and then sort of the early stages of a conference, and then we're going to start getting into the rules of procedure. So before the conference, when we first show up at a school, right, negotiations start as soon as we get there, right? As soon as we arrive, the negotiations begin. But everybody has their own style. So like some delegates will show up at a conference, they'll find out who else is in their committee, and they'll start talking to them, hey, what school are you from, you know? And they'll just try to establish like a personal connection with them. They may ask them some of the things about the committee, but it won't be in character, it won't be as a country. They'll go and they'll just sort of be who they are. And when roll call starts, then they shift into character. They're a country now, and from that point forward, they talk that way the entire time. Except like during lunch, then they go back to being themselves, right? Nobody's going to be a country while you're eating hamburgers. Other people, when they show up, they have a more formal countenance about them. They have a more formal approach. So when they walk around, if everybody's been given their placards or their name tags and stuff, and you can see which country, who's representing which country and what committee they're in, some people will walk up and say, hello, Brazil, how are you? I'm Cameroon, looking forward to this conference. And then they'll start talking to them about what they're going to be discussing later on. Which approach you choose is entirely up to you. The only thing I don't want to have happen is that we show up to a conference, we're there at the beginning, roll call hasn't been taken yet, open ceremonies, which is the first thing that happens, hasn't been taken, and you're huddled around a bunch of COC delegates. We didn't do this so you can hang out with your friends at College of the Canyons. You can do that back in the Santa Clarita Valley, right? But when we get there, I want you to immediately start mingling. Hit the ground running, right? Go start talking to people, introduce yourself. Whoever's hosting, whichever school is hosting the conference, the first thing that happens is I usually go and register the team. I let them know, hey, College of the Canyons is here, and all 20 delegates showed up, or whatever the number is. Or if somebody didn't show up, look, we only have 18 delegates. These are the 2 delegates who didn't show up. And that way they can make adjustments too. Usually at that point, if they're really well organized, they'll say, here's a packet, and they'll give you a packet that has the placards, right? The names of the countries or characters that you're representing. So they'll just give me a whole stack of them. And then sometimes they'll give name tags. Like sometimes they'll just be like name tags that you can just stick on your blouse or your shirt that'll say Cameron. Oftentimes it'll say your country's name or character's name, and then below that it'll say the name of the committee that you're in. And so you can walk around and you can see who's in your committee. So you get your placards, you get your name tags. Sometimes they have refreshments. They aren't usually very good. If you want coffee, get it then, because it's gonna suck later on, because they're usually not gonna refill it, so it's gonna be the same coffee for days on end, for the remainder of the conference. Not the multi-day conferences, the one-day conferences. The multi-day conferences, they usually won't have refreshments, just water. The very first thing that happens at any conference is what's called opening ceremonies. And what happens is all the delegates from all the schools get together in one room, and the general secretary, the person running the entire conference, gets up and they give a speech. At some of the bigger colleges, they'll have a guest speaker who comes up and speaks. For the most part, I'll tell you from my own personal feelings, most of the time the speakers are kind of boring. The reality is the students have studied really hard to prepare for the conference, so they really don't want to listen to anyone talk. But that's usually the way it goes down. Now here's one thing you need to remember. I said we always try to be COC nice. That's our motto, that's what we do. But at opening ceremonies, one of the things that we always do is we sit in the very back. the last row. And in closing ceremonies, we sit in the very back, the same thing. Here's why we do it, mostly for closing ceremonies. Because if we're sitting in the very back and we win an award, we have the longest walk up to get that award and the longest walk back. And so we sit in the back. It's kind of crappy, but we're nice all the other times. So that's the one thing we do. Now, one of the things that's happened is a lot of students who graduated from COC and moved into other colleges like USC or things like that, they now do the same thing. So sometimes we're battling with other schools to sit in the back, but we were the originals on sitting in the back. That's fine. After the speeches, the hosts of the conference will introduce the chairs of the various committees, and then they'll go ahead and gavel the conference open. They're gaveling the conference open. They have a gavel. They'll hit it on the podium and say, the Secretary General, the person in charge of the whole conference, will say, this conference is now open, right? And then what you typically do is you follow the chairs back to your individual committee rooms, right? And then that's where they'll take roll call and do all the things that we're going to talk about now. Just so you know, what I do is after the conference starts, I generally start going from committee room to committee room to committee room, just checking on delegates to see how you're doing. And just so you know, this is true even with experienced delegates. They'll be getting up to give a speech. These will be students who've known me for a couple years. They're feeling confident, they're feeling good. They'll see the door open, they'll see me walk in, and they're like, ugh, and they freeze, they choke. Don't worry if I'm in the room. Don't even look to see if I'm in the room. Just do your thing. Do what you've been trained to do. Just practice. What you've practiced, just do it, okay? So that's the main thing. What I want to do now is go to the information that's on flow chart number 1. And what we're going to talk about in this video, and we'll pick it up later on, is roll call. We've already talked about some of this. So roll call, like I said before, is how they determine who's in attendance, right? Which countries or which characters are there. So the chair will go through the list alphabetically. So if you're Zimbabwe, hang on, because it's going to be a while before they call you. As I said before, the chair will take roll and use that to determine how many delegates are there, and then what constitutes a majority and what constitutes a 2/3 majority. Again, during roll call, that's where delegates declare their voting status. COC delegates are always present. We always say present. So if you're Cameroon, the chair says Cameroon, you're going to say that you're present, always. That allows you to abstain on substantive matters if you want. Now there's a specific terminology that you have to use when roll call happens. And I want you to understand this, and you need to practice it over and over again, because there's nothing natural about the way that we speak at Model United Nations conferences. And so you're going to want to practice this over and over and over again, so that by the time you come to your first simulation, which is going to be really soon, I want this to kind of roll off your tongue. And we're going to talk about that in the next video.